having me. And I can see this is going to be a challenge today because I usually speak with a mic. So let me ask first, can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, good. If that changes, let me know. Sometimes I tend to ramp down a little bit. Okay, today my topic is short answers to the tough questions. And you might be asking, why do we need to know this? And you know, it's because when we are candidates and we are asked questions by reporters or talking TV heads or whatever, you know, they don't want to listen for an hour or two. They want it in 30 seconds or 60 seconds, and they cut us off after that time. So we have to be able to give short answers. And I had to do this when I ran for county commission. My very first office, my county chair said, "Oh, you don't need to worry. This is a paper candidacy. You know, there's never any debates. There's never any interviews. You can be a paper candidate." And I said, "I think I can handle that." Well, that was the year they decided that they were going to have debates and interviews. So I got to learn the hard way. And hopefully when you go out there, instead of learning the hard way, because you're in this training today, you will have a little bit better place to be coming from and know a little bit more than I did and not have to have so much of a trial by fire. So, one of the reasons we need short answers is they only give us soundbite time. That's it. And we can use this to our advantage because one of the things that most other candidates do is they say the same boring non-thing. Now, we as libertarian candidates actually can answer the questions. We can have good answers. Answers that get people excited and make them want to have more questions for us. For example, when we ran in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which was the place I initially started, we would have the Democrat, Republican, and Libertarian candidate in the classroom. Now, the government classrooms would invite us in and we'd come in and we'd give our answers to the questions that were proposed. And these were kind of standard answers. Democrats and Republicans said the same old, same old. Libertarians said something new and refreshing. So when the audience got to question us, the Libertarians got all the questions. And this is what you want to do with your answers, is you want to invite more questions. So, and also you have to be very aware of your audience. I mean, if you're talking to a liberal audience, you want to answer with heart. If you are talking with somebody who just, wants a solution to a problem, you might give a pragmatic or a different type of answer. It's important to know your audience if you can. You don't always have that advantage, but if you do, use it. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And in case you're thinking that this is easy, it's not. You have to do your homework. And what I recommend for all candidates to do is sit down and make a list of questions that you think you're going to get asked. And be exhaustive. Think of ones that maybe will get asked, but probably won't. Really be exhaustive, and then have a short answer for each of those questions. What we used to do is put them on index cards, and then we would practice, so that we have the answers ready. Because let's face it, if you're on television, if you're getting questioned over the phone or the radio, sometimes you can draw a blank if you're not prepared. So preparation is very, very important. So once you kind of get the idea of how to do the short answers, you can make that preparation. That's what we're going to talk about next. Now, as libertarians, one of the things you're going to get are hostile questions. We're different, right? So people think that that's bad sometimes, and so they'll ask us questions in a very hostile tone. And usually what they're telling us is that they want to help someone or save the environment or do something good, and that they feel that we don't want that. So one of the first things to think about in the grand suburban pivot, and this is, I should mention, this is something that the advocates for self-government are very, they really push this, and this is a very good technique, is to establish rapport with a hostile questioner by acknowledging the benevolent intent. So the way to do that, for example, is to start out, we all want to live in a society that, where no one has to worry about starving in the streets. If they just ask you, well, won't the poor starve in a libertarian society? You can start out by acknowledging their benevolent intent, by saying something along these lines. You know, we all want to live in a society where the environment is clean. We want to live in a society where the poor aren't starving in the streets, or whatever it is. And that usually creates a different tone for you. So whenever you get a hostile question, you can start this way. Now, for the rest of what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm not going to go ahead and start this way, but you can and you should if you're getting hostile questions, or anytime you feel like you've kind of lost rapport with your audience. This is a very good technique to get it back. Highly recommended. And as I said, the Advocates for Self-Government promote that. Maybe I'll mention their website here for those of you who want to learn more. The Advocates for Self-Government actually is an organization that specializes in teaching libertarians how to deliver a message. So it's a really good thing for everyone to know about. And their website is theadvocates.org. T-H-E, the word advocates.org. Now, obviously, it's always best to be prepared. So one of the things I encourage you to do as a candidate is to get deeper into the philosophy so that you don't get surprised. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to give you an example of a question that the answer to which has evolved over the years, so you can kind of get a feel of what I'm talking about. Let's go back to this one. Wouldn't the poor starve in a libertarian society? Well, you know, back in the 80s when I started running, there were some candidates who had some very kind of, I'd say, antisocial answers. You would say, possibly. But tax-supported welfare is immoral. If people must starve to maintain our principles, so be it. Needless to say, this answer to that goes very well. And actually, in my opinion, it didn't really reflect our philosophy. I mean, if there's a society where people aren't going to starve, it's the libertarian society, because it's a wealthy society. Would you rather be poor in India or poor in the United States? It's pretty clear the poor are going to do better in a libertarian society. Not that the U.S. is libertarian, but it's more libertarian than India. Okay, so as we learned more about our philosophy, the answer evolved. And I don't know if people in the back can actually read what's on the slide here, so I'll go ahead and read it, which I don't normally do. You know, then the answer became more like, the poor would have more in a libertarian society. Private charities give 2/3 of every dollar to the needy, while government welfare only delivers half of that. So government welfare delivers more to the middle class administrators than those who really need our help. Now, this was an evolution in the understanding of our philosophy that private charity, private resources do better than public ones for those in need. So this was another evolution. But this answer evolved even more. One of my favorite answers is poverty, as we know it today, wouldn't exist in a libertarian society. Life-threatening poverty is largely a creation of government regulation that destroys jobs, especially jobs for the disadvantaged. Now, if you are a typical libertarian audience, half of you are nodding your head saying, yep, that's right. The other half of you are going, I'm not so sure. And no shame associated with that. Again, I think even for me, I feel like the philosophy is still evolving for me. I feel like I learn new things every day. So, you know, one of the things I do want to share with you is how important it is to understand this answer, because wealth solves a lot of problems. And, you know, and to give you an example in a whole different arena, let's talk about the environment. If you're poor, so poor that you spend all your day hunting and groveling for food and going out in the forest and picking berries and stuff, you really don't care that much if you're polluting, if you're cutting trees or destroying the environment or doing something else to get that. You just don't care, because number one is survival. It's when you're wealthy enough that you don't have to worry about using every minute to survive, that you can care about the environment and spend resources taking care of it. So wealth solves a lot of problems, but that's why I'm going to take a minute out from short answers and explain this a little more, because I think every candidate who runs as a libertarian should appreciate this very important point of our philosophy. So to do that, I'm going to show you one of the figures from Healing Our World. And I know people in the back are probably having a little bit of hard time seeing this, so I'll go through this a little more slowly. These are years. They start at 1725 and go out to 1975. And this is the GNP per capita in 2,000 US dollars. I know this sounds pretty complicated, but let's make it real easy. Basically, what I'm showing you is the amount of wealth that the third world lives on and the amount that the developed world lived on. But what I want you to know is right here, where everybody was living on the same thing. And this line goes way out here to the beginning of recorded history. It used to be that all of us lived on less than $1,000 and $2,001 a year. That means we were all really poor. And something changed here in the 1800s. What was it? The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was only made possible by the property rights that we enjoy here in the U.S. and really enjoy here in the U.S. and believe it or not, in Britain too, because after they lost the colonies, they changed their mind about some things. They changed some of their laws and they cut back on taxes and regulation, so they were able to join in the Industrial Revolution. And then Europe said, hey, we can get rid of our monarchs or kind of demote them to ceremonial status, and we can enjoy freedom too, and we can partake in the Industrial Revolution, and the developed world took off. They started creating huge amounts of wealth. But here back in the third world, not much changed. Even today, the third world does not have property rights as we know. A lot of the land doesn't have what we call clear title, and you can read more about that in Healing Our World if you want. So they stay poor, dictators. This is what happens. This is what aggression through government does. It keeps you poor. So it's really important to understand that freedom allowed, for the first time in our history, allowed us to have wealth. And those who didn't have that freedom didn't have wealth. It's a very important point. Now, let's look at government impact on wealth. In this graph, also from Healing Our World, you see total government spending as a percentage of the GDP, which is another way of saying wealth creation. Okay, so in this bar are countries that spent less than where their governments have spent less than 25% of their GDP. In other words, the government spent only 25% or less of the wealth of the citizens. Up here, they spent more than 60% of the wealth of their citizens. And notice, over here on this graph, this is the annual growth of real GDP. In other words, how much wealth those countries can create. And notice, if government doesn't spend much, there's a lot of wealth creation. If government spends a lot, there isn't. Why is that? Because government's inefficient. Doesn't know how to spend it, doesn't have those price signals, right? So it's inefficient. So the lessons to be taken from these two slides is if you want wealth, which solves a lot of problems, you have to be free. And secondly, if you want to keep growing that wealth must be kept in the hands and spent by the private citizens, not the government, or it will retard the growth of wealth. So this is very important for us to understand libertarian. So I wanted to share that with you today. When you understand that, a lot of questions that are asked actually become a lot easier to answer. And now I will return to the short answer part of my talk. Okay. There's a certain mindset that is good to have in your head when you're trying to create your short answers, or if you get caught with a question that the answer doesn't immediately come to mind. And first of all, as we've shared a little bit, and we'll share further in this hour, we'd like to awaken the curiosity by saying delightfully unexpected. And because we want people to ask us more questions. They want us to come after the forum and ask us if they don't want to raise their hand. The other thing to think about is that liberty works and government doesn't. And liberty, that's because liberty is moral and government isn't. I mean, I think it's very important to link the moral and the practical. I know back in the olden days, in the 80s, there was a lot of talk about, well, should we talk about morality? Morality is the only thing. The practical stuff isn't important. But those two are linked. There's no difference. The moral and practical are linked. I think it's very important to consider that when you put your answers together. Because if your answer doesn't seem practical, then you might want to look at the philosophy a little more and make sure that you're on track with the philosophy. Okay, so, and if something's wrong, almost every question you're going to get asked, this is going to be true for. You're getting asked the question because things have gotten really bad, and they've gotten really bad usually because government has interfered. Usually when government isn't interfering, people don't see what's going on as a big problem. But when government starts interfering, the problem gets bigger. And this is something to think about as a candidate, because you can look for where government has interfered, and then you're going to be able to answer the question better. Now sometimes that requires research, sometimes not. It just depends, of course, on where you are and what your question is. And of course the solution then is always more liberty, not less. That's pretty obvious to us, I think, as libertarians. And another thing I want to suggest is that in many cases, not all, but in many cases, liberty renders the problem obsolete. We just talked about that in respect to poverty. I'm going to talk about it in respect to abortion in a little bit, because that is a question that comes up a lot. So to keep all these things in mind as you're, getting your index cards out and writing your answers, I think this will help you design an answer that fits your audience, that fits you as a person, and fits the office for which you're running. I mean, it's all important to make that all work together. Now, I'm going to go through several short answers that I personally like. They may not be your short answers because it needs to be an answer that resonates with you as a person. So I just throw these out as examples, and you should feel free to either plagiarize them, toss them in the basket, or make up your own. And in fact, as time goes on, as you answer more questions, you'll find that you have a natural affinity for certain answers, and that you will have certain points that you personally like to get into. Now, another thing I want to talk about in these answers is sometimes they come in two parts. For example, sometimes you have 10 or 20 seconds, or maybe 30 if you're lucky, to answer the question. Sometimes you have 2 minutes. So it's kind of good to have like a punchline, your 10, 20 second line, and then to have more information if you have time to give it. So for example, I've demonstrated that in the education question. Again, I don't normally read my slides, but I'm going to because I'm not sure those in the back can read this. So the question is, how will the poor be able to afford an education in a libertarian society? And I like to say, right up front, I like to get their attention and say education can be virtually free in a libertarian society, making it affordable for everyone. Now, of course, jaws will drop if you won't give that kind of an answer. And again, you have to judge whether your audience is ready for that much of a jaw dropper. The audiences that I've talked to have been ready, I felt, and I have a lot of questions afterwards. So that's how I personally like to do it. And then more explanation if you have more time. Educational TV shows, much like Sesame Street, could be sponsored by advertisers. Educational cable channels would probably cost just a few dollars per month. Interactive internet schooling would be cost effective as well. Children would have plenty of time to develop social skills through sports, outings, and participation in community activities. Like most services provided by government, today's education is expensive and inefficient. So something like that, something along those lines might be good. Okay, so that's one angle. It's probably a question you're going to get, everybody gets asked about education. And again, you may have an entirely different slant you'd like to take, perfectly okay. Or if you like my answer, just use it. Okay, so let's talk about the environment. This is one I've gotten a lot personally. In a libertarian society, looters would run rampant. People think libertarians aren't interested in the environment. So I like to turn to the responsibility part of the non-aggression principle and say in a libertarian society, polluters, whether individuals, corporations, or governments, would be required to clean up their garbage. Today, the country's biggest polluter, the U.S. military, literally gets away with murder because government has sovereign immunity. Here they're talking about putting the fox in charge of the hen house. It's a great point that you can make on the environment. So that's another way to go. And again, if you give answers like this, of course, you need to have documentation to back it up. That's one reason I wrote Healing Our World. It has over 1,000 references, and these references point to studies that show just exactly this. So, that's why it's a good idea to, and I'll tell you how to access all this stuff at the end of the talk, but, you do need backup if you're going to say something like this. So, you don't want to just hang out there with no documentation. Put it on your index cards, bring them with you. You don't have to read your index cards, but if somebody asks you for a reference and you don't remember it, you have it handy. So, and I always tell people if they want a reference that I'll give to them after the talk, or if for some reason I don't have the reference handy, then I offer to send it to them through email or telephone, whatever it is that they need to have it. And if you're prepared like that and you can give references, it's quite impressive because your colleagues will, I shouldn't say colleagues, I said your opponents will not have that information, I can guarantee it. Okay, so let's look at another one. Okay, in libertarian societies, pushers would be in our schools selling drugs to children. Anybody who has a child knows that's already a reality, but okay, so now I'd like to make the point, again, this is kind of like a little bit of a Ransburger pivot here. Pushers are in virtually every school today because black market profits are so high. If we care about our children, let them know you care. Because we are considered uncaring. We need to get away with that, do away with that image. If we care about our children, we need to decriminalize drugs and remove the profit incentive. Without profit, pushers will leave on their own. And again, if you get questions about that, there are countries where this has actually happened. In the Netherlands, of course, kids don't bother smoking marijuana that much anymore. It's really dropped. Addiction levels have dropped in younger groups because, as the Dutch authorities put it, we've managed to make drugs boring. Portugal too, yes, there's lots of examples. Back in the 80s when I was running, we didn't have any of these examples. We had to get up there and say this stuff without any backup. So, you really have an advantage today. Okay. All right, let's try another one. Oh yeah, in a libertarian society, only the rich would be able to afford health care. Well, I could give several talks on this, as most of you know. But you don't have time, so you gotta give short answers. Okay. In a libertarian society, the cost of pharmaceuticals and healthcare would be only about 20% of what they are today, making it more affordable, not less. And you get to reference me on this one. I'm actually writing a book to document this, but of course the documentation is already on my website, so it's really an exciting area, and healthcare is going to come up because of all the snafus around Obamacare, so that's another thing to be prepared for. And then you can continue. Before government interference in the healthcare industry, people could afford to pay their medical bills even without insurance. Even government cannot afford to cover these costs today, so healthcare rationing is already happening. And if you have had a loved one who's died in recent years in the hospital, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't had that misfortune, and I hope you haven't, if it comes to visit you, please be with your loved one. Have somebody at their bedside all the time, because unfortunately, the hospital staff is so overworked that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you're there for your loved one, they will get better attention. And I suspect there are many deaths in the hospital because help wasn't available at the time it was needed. And this is not a slur against our healthcare workers. They're fantastic. But because of regulations and licensing laws, there's not enough of them there. So, that's another area where you could write a book or have a big long talk, but you only get a short answer. So you need to put it in something that speaks to you. Okay. Let's take the abortion issue. Okay, this is one of my personal favorites. I like to say in a libertarian society, abortion would probably become obsolete. This gets a lot of attention. People want to know how that is. And then I like to continue. Better birth control methods would be available, as would the technology to transfer the fetus from one womb to another. If we put all our time, money, and effort into achieving these breakthroughs instead of lobbying for new legislation, abortion would soon be obsolete. You know, you can believe that a physician is not going to abort a fetus when he can transfer it to another willing womb. That's not going to happen. It's just going to be considered unethical. So, you know, there's a lot of potential here. This is not around the corner, but it isn't too far away. It's within our realm, so it'll be interesting to see how this pans out. Obviously, you may have your own very strong feelings about abortion, and you may want to talk about them instead. I am simply giving you some options here, and I'm trying to get you to think outside the box as a candidate, because that's what attracts the attention of your voting populace. You know, part of the reason we run, if you think about why we run, most of us who run as candidates don't expect to get elected. And that's the reality. We want to get elected, but the reality is that most of us won't. So why are we out there? Well, yes, we support the ticket, but there's another very important reason. We are teaching people what it means to be libertarian. So we want to make sure that we do a good job at it. And this is something, you know, and that's one reason why it's good to be a little bit provocative. Again, it depends on your temperament and your audience. You have to judge that. It's a subtle thing. But we want to get people to think outside the box, just as we have, because that's the only way we're going to make inroads in getting people to think about responsibility and to think about freedom in the way that we do. Okay, so another one that's popular today is supporting the troops. You should support our troops instead of bragging about the war, another hostile approach. And I like to say I support our troops who would die for us by not endangering them for anything other than immediate defense of our nation. And these people are going to lay down their lives for us, and we're going to just, you know, throw them over there for big oil or whatever? No, I don't think so. Or to be really brief, I support our troops by bringing them home alive, ASAP. That's right. Yeah. I mean, those are ways you can handle that. And again, this isn't the only way you can handle it, but it's giving you some fodder for creating your own answer, hopefully. So I want to just review what we've talked about here. Awaken curiosity by saying the delightfully unexpected. Remember that liberty works and government doesn't, because liberty is moral and most government isn't. You know, make that connection in your own mind, it'll come out in your answers. And if something is wrong, it's probably already been elevated to a major problem by government interference. The solution, always, it's more liberty, not less. And liberty generally renders the problem, or a lot of problems, I should say, obsolete. So keep that in mind. Now I want to actually cover one other area that isn't exactly short answers, but I think is important. And this is the non-aggression principle. But I want to talk about this a little bit, because there's a feeling among some libertarians that maybe it's not good to talk about the non-aggression principle. So I am not in that camp. I think it's a good thing to talk about. I think people love it, and I'm going to give you a few examples of why you should consider talking about it if you get the chance. Now, granted, as a candidate, you don't often get the chance, but if you do, you may want to go ahead and say something. So, when I was a candidate in Kalamazoo, the teachers that we had debates in front of liked the libertarians so much that they invited us in. I know I personally was invited in for the next 10 years in several government and college classes, for every one of their government classes. It was amazing. Okay, and the way I approached these classes is I would start by putting 3 things on the board. One thing was the minority should rule the majority. The second thing was the majority should rule the minority. The third thing was everyone should rule themselves, as long as they don't initiate force, fraud, or theft against their neighbor. And then I would start my presentation by asking the class if they got to choose how the government was run, which one of these would they choose? And guess what? 90 to 100% raised their hands on the libertarian non-aggression principle. You know, that's something people instinctively gravitate to. Then I asked them, before I told them it was the libertarian principle, mind you, I asked them, how do you perceive that the U.S. government operates today? And they chose again. And now nobody chose, I think maybe I had one person in the whole 10 years choose the non-aggression principle. Most of them chose either the majority should rule the minority or the minority. A lot of them said the minority should rule the majority. That's how they perceive the government actually works today. So I said, okay, so you all want something more libertarian. And that's the way we started. See, people naturally gravitate to the libertarian principle. And when they hear the non-aggression principle, they're going, yeah. But of course, they don't understand what that means. As we got deeper into the class, obviously, there was some conflict because sometimes people don't realize the implications of the non-aggression principle. But, talking about it is a positive thing. Now, I want to give you one more little story. I ran my second race as city commission. For city commission, it was supposed to be a nonpartisan race, but it was made partisan by the press. There's a whole slate of us that were libertarians, and the press called us libertarians. They kept labeling us. Of course, we got questions as libertarians. Remember, this is in the early 80s. The first thing they asked is, you mean you're librarians? After they got over that. So then they started asking us about the philosophy, and of course, they had to because the press was saying we were for drug legalization. They were rolling out our whole platform, right? So we had to answer these questions, and we did. We were young and we were fearless, and we just told it as we saw it. And amazingly enough, there were like 4 slates running. The establishment slate, which were the ones who were already elected, they won. But the libertarians came in second, and it was a strong second. And the other 2, which were, kind of middle of the road type slates, they bit the dust. They really didn't have much. So we did very well, but we didn't win. At least not in that respect. Actually, 2 of us on our slate were probably the first appointed libertarians in the country to the Public Safety Task Force in Kalamazoo. So we did sort of win that, but that wasn't even the big win. The big win came later. The city of Kalamazoo wanted to take a bunch of land by eminent domain and reroute the railroads in Kalamazoo. Because, Kalamazoo is such a big city. And then they just thought we need a big city plan, And I was employed by the Upjohn Company, which was the biggest employer in the area, and to keep Upjohn quiet, what they were doing is they were taking land by eminent domain and giving a bunch of it to Upjohn so they'd keep their mouth shut, and then they were, of course, going to use the rest for rail consolidation. So we went to a meeting, myself and some other libertarians, where the citizenry was gathered together to fight this. And an older gentleman came up to me, and he put $200 in cash in my hand. And he said, Dr. Ruwart, they're going to take away my bicycle shop, the one that my brother and I have been building up all these years. And I know your employer, is going to, profit from this. But I know you're on my side, Dr. Ruwart, because you are a libertarian. And so I want you to take this money, which back in the early 80s is a lot of money, and I want you to fight it for me. And of course, we were going to fight it anyhow, but that helped out. We joined the coalition that was fighting it. It was defeated, soundly defeated, and I wish I had figured out what I'm going to tell you now, because it took me all this time to really get it. And that is that, I got part of it, but only part of it. The part I got was when you run a principled campaign, when you tell people what you're about as a libertarian, then you become the Ghostbusters against big government for them. We're the people that we want them to come to when big government comes knocking at their door. Because those people will be dedicated libertarians. You can bet if I ran for city commission again, I would have had that gentleman's vote. Not only that, he probably would have had signs all over his bicycle shop, right? Because people vote for their heroes. And that's the part I didn't quite get at the time, and I want to share with you. You're out there as a candidate, and you're advertising what the Libertarian Party is all about. And we may not win many elections, but there is something we do win. We win at the local level, rolling back taxes, eminent domain, and other types of regulations, and we do a damn good job at it. We really do. If you read the newspaper, the Libertarian Party news back in the 80s and 90s, you saw all the local things that were overturned or prevented by the Libertarians, but we didn't celebrate those in the way we should have. We were so focused on doing what the big boys do, which is win the election, that we didn't realize where our strength lies. And I think one of the biggest things we do as candidates is advertise our Ghostbuster position. And then if we have people come to us asking for our help, or if we help them just because we're there at the meeting, so to speak, that's where our strength lies. We do really well at that. And ironically enough, if we do really well at that, guess who they're going to vote for? They're heroes and heroines, right? It's a win-win situation. So I think maybe we have, as a Libertarian Party, put our emphasis slightly in the wrong place in terms of thinking of winning elections rather than winning hearts and minds first, or in conjunction. And I believe if we do local level activism, which we will do as a candidate, and we will do after the election, whether we're a candidate or not, we will have much more power after we're candidates, just as I did in that situation in Kalamazoo. They knew who to come to. And because I've been on TV a lot and things like that, people listened to me if I got back on. So, you as a candidate are developing a power base that can be used to really roll back big government at the local level. You don't have to wait to get elected to do it. So I want to really emphasize that and encourage you to think about that when you're out campaigning.
Yes, I have a question. Back on the previous slide, you were talking about, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but I think it was non-aggression. So I wanted to talk about, there you go, colonialism, which is something that our planet is engaged in for half a millennium at least, and some people say we still are. So what is your answer?
In what respect? Because that's a big topic.
Do you think colonialism is in effect? Do you think it affects our world negatively or positively? And how are you going to compensate the victims?
Well, compensation of the victim is that's a really good question, the compensation of the victim. It is extremely difficult to compensate your victim the farther away you are from the crime. For example, let's take the slavery situation here in the U.S. That's probably, it's not exactly colonialism, but I think it addresses your question.
That's a hype of colonialism.
It addresses your question. So what's very difficult about it is that if you were to tax, say, all of the white people to give something to all the black people as reparations, some of these white people have, ran the Underground Railroad. Some of them might have been fighting for abolition, some of them, so it's hard to know how do you do that. And of course, the people living now aren't the people living then. So there can be a very big problem. In other words, you can make the problem worse. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to think it through, but as you get farther and farther, it becomes more and more difficult. And that's why it is so important. I think the lesson to be learned here, it's so very important to have the non-aggression principle in place. Because if you deviate from it for any length of time, and let's face it, with slavery we did, and then 100 years later you try to figure out reparations, you're in a position where no matter what you do, it'll be probably the wrong thing. The best thing, I think, though, the best, quote, reparations we can make for the black people now, I believe, is to stop the government intervention that is still keeping them as an underclass. And I will explain that. I'll bullet it, and then for explanation we can talk later because I want other people to have a chance. We keep, and I know this because I rented primarily to blacks and the low-income blacks in Michigan. Our welfare system makes the men desert their children, breaks up the family. The minimum wage keeps them from getting the entry-level job. The licensing laws keeps them from doing simple things like childcare in their homes or driving their car, their cab, and of course, now that we've taken, and all these things hit the disadvantaged the most. So now that we've taken away all their ability to climb the rungs of the success ladder, the only thing left of them is to sell drugs, for example. And then we throw them in prison, and we throw the blacks in prison at a much greater rate than we do the whites. So, class war is still happening, and you can tell your black friends that ask about discrimination, yeah, you're being discriminated against, but probably not in the way you think. It's all hidden. I feel like...
It's very obtuse.
Yes, I feel like writing a book called The Roots of Discrimination, kind of going through this step by step because I really think it's, I thought about doing it as a fiction book. I think maybe that would be more powerful, but really, this is something, libertarians have, we have an understanding of it, I think, that other people do not, and we can really go to those who have been disadvantaged and tell them, yeah, you're being discriminated against, but they've kind of hidden in the way like this. If you go to ij.org, you can really get a good feel for that. That's why I recommend that site. So I hope I've answered your question.
Well, I think you started, and I appreciate it very much. What about the My Lai massacre?
Actually,
War crime.
yeah,
How are we going to compensate the victims?
yeah, that's going to be a tough one. But I'm going to answer some other questions. Come back to me after. I'll stay after for as long as people have questions. Okay? Yes.
You state a pretty strong position against eminent domain. There are many instances that for the public good that we have government infrastructure, drainage ditches, highways, and so forth. And it's happened in the past, and partially the reason that we've got eminent domain is the corruption is to the people on planning level or knowledge of planning level. If you don't have eminent domain, they can go out and secure title to key pieces of property and extort extreme money from the public or eliminate the necessary highway, drainage ditch, water line, right-of-way, whatever that needs to serve. What is your solution of one type of corruption versus the other type of corruption?
Well, I think both types of corruption come from the fact that we've given the government that power. We've given our government officials either the power of eminent domain or the power to play these power games, because they get to decide whether or not we get the vote or something. And that's why things probably should be market-based and should be private, because then we eliminate that whole thing.
And you create John D. Rockefeller by controlling the bridge on his oil.
Well, now Rockefeller, it's a very interesting situation with Rockefeller. He reduced the price for the masses. It was like slashed something like 70% by his technology, and that's why he became a monopoly. Then he tried to keep his monopoly, and he had trouble because what happened was the other oil companies said, hey, if he raises his price to a monopoly price, we'll just undersell him. And they did. He was very frustrated. He tried to get a cartel together of all the other oil people and said, look, if we all keep our prices high, we got them. But of course, there was always one member of the group who said, but if I undersell, I get the whole pie. So they'd undersell. So Rockefeller was very frustrated. Now, at the same time, AT&T was going through the same thing. Their patents expired, or they had competition. They didn't like this. So they did what John Rockefeller didn't and wanted to. And they went to the government and said, there should be a monopoly. This is a natural monopoly. Government should outlaw anybody but AT&T. It should happen at the local level, of course. But so what happened is basically AT&T got the legislature to make them a monopoly. And they were a monopoly for many, many years. I remember when MCI first came out with long distance, and they had to take AT&T to court on antitrust in order to provide cheaper long distance. And so that's what happened. You see, the only way they can really keep the monopoly is by going to the government. John D. Rockefeller lost his monopoly. By the time the antitrust people convicted him, he had already lost something like 40% of his monopoly because he couldn't force people to pay the high prices. So, the monopolist is kind of a myth. And again, I go into it in Healing Our World.
But do you have a solution?
Yeah, the only solution.
Do you agree that there are some things like our highway system that government?
What about the
Or do you
roads?
think that we can have a private company that collects our gasoline tax to provide us our highway system?
I believe that we can have everything privatized. And and again, I kind of go into that in healing our world, but, but I think everything will be privatized. And I realize not all libertarians think that way, and they like to keep some of the functions, as part of government. And, again, that's just part of looking at the philosophy and getting into it. When I did that, I realized that any monopoly really only could be implemented by force. And as soon as it was initiation of force, then to me that wasn't legitimate. And what I found is that not only wasn't it legitimate, but it didn't really work out to the best interests. And again, I realize everyone doesn't feel that way in this room. That's cool. We can have some great discussions, and that's fantastic. Yes?
J.J. Hill, Great Northern Railroad, no eminent domain. And interestingly, if you study him parallel to the other railroad companies, he did marvelously well because there wasn't all that lobbying, jockeying for special interests, etc.
That's right.
So short answer, J.J. Hill and the Great Northern Railroad, no eminent domain.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Totally
Yes.
right.
In San Antonio, with your book, How Liberty Empowers Women and Minorities and Handicap, what would you say would be like a premier issue that you would address here?
I'm sorry, what would I say about which issue?
What would be if you had to boil it down to one issue or something that you are familiar with or in San Antonio, is there anything you would address or?
Well, I don't live in San Antonio, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask that question. But maybe those of you who live in San Antonio have an answer.
Say it again.
Which is a big issue for
Well, I
minorities
was, in your book, like How Liberty Empowers Women and Minorities, I was trying to think if there was anything that you would like present to us in that book, that in like one issue.
It's a DVD, it's a 1 hour talk. I think, probably here, I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing that there's a big thing about illegals here, and how they're going to immigration and how that all is going to fit. And I don't cover that in that DVD, so maybe you think that the San Antonio question is something, that isn't in there for you. Yes?
What would you say regarding the school system, the public school system, I guess in poor districts?
Well, that's part of the problem with the educational system we have today is parents in poor districts are forced to send their children to a school where the first class is physical survival. No parent should be put in that position. And yet, we put these barriers up for homeschooling. I understand Texas is a little better that way. But even there, even if a parent wants to homeschool and say they have to both work because they're poor, they can't send their child to another parent who's homeschooling necessarily, because then it's a school instead of homeschooling, and there's all these extra regulations and things. So we really handicap our poor by making the system based on where you live. Why can't they go somewhere else? And of course, the solution is not to have government school, because government schools cost, the taxpayer, at least twice as much as a private school. And the private schools probably cost, from what I'm hearing from the homeschooling community, I'm going to say 2 to 4 times as much as a homeschooler, although one parent stays home, so you got to kind of count that. But if you were, if people were allowed to have neighborhood schools where a couple parents stayed home and had all the kids in the neighborhood and taught them because they were confused and things like that, you would have very inexpensive schooling. I mean, schooling is really, think about it, back in the olden days, before my time, there was a blackboard up here. The teacher went and wrote on the blackboard, had the students read from the books, lecture. What do they do today? Basically the same thing. And yet our transportation was different. Back in the olden days, they walked to school and rode a horse. And today, they come in cars. I mean, everything's changed but our educational system. It's crazy. Yes?
I wanted to tag on to that as well. I think that it's a huge issue, education, especially because you're talking about how the government keeps the core education. I think it's the ground level component of getting them to rise out of something. I think when I talk to, try to sell this idea to liberals in particular, it's so hard to do because it really gets to the core of what's wrong with dependence on government to provide. And shaking that mindset is probably the hardest thing, I think, for the Libertarian Party, trying to sell it to people in those communities. I was wondering if you know, maybe a special strategy to kind of speak directly to those people in a way that is easily digestible and not too heavy on economics.
You know, if they feed their hummingbirds, you can get to them. Because if you look at the little brochure that comes with the hummingbird feeder, it says right in the little feeder, it says, you know, it's great to have the hummingbirds come and eat your feeder, but every week when it runs out, let it run out for a couple days. The reason is, if you keep feeding them, they'll become dependent on your feeder. And when it comes time that you're not there on vacation or whatever, they're going to have a really hard time. So, you know, even with our animals, we understand that dependency can be bad. Now, of course, in my situation, I can actually tell stories, which is really helpful. If you know, one of the things I like to recommend, if you're going to be a regular Libertarian candidate, it might be worth it to think of something that appeals to your heart and work there, because you'll learn so much. Like what I did, I saw that the poor in the Kalamazoo area didn't have any decent housing. I wanted to get into real estate and rehab property. So I thought, I'll do it with low-income housing, because I was naive and didn't realize what the problem was. What did I learn? Okay, and I can tell you hundreds of stories about how the city government really made life difficult for these people, how welfare really destroyed the family, how it, you know, one of my favorite stories is in Michigan. What would happen is I'd get a woman who was 15 or 16, I don't want to go over my time here, let me know. 15 or 16 come to me and say, I'm pregnant, I'm going to drop out of high school and have this child, because when I do, the state of Michigan will give me a welfare check and I can establish my own household. This was the rite of passage for many black women in that area. And so she'd do that, right? Okay. And then she realized pretty quickly, oops, I don't have enough money in this welfare check to support me and my kid. But if I have a second one, I get a bigger check. So she had the second one. And then John, oops, this isn't enough money. So she had the third one. And the third one was the end of the line. We had any more than three, they didn't get more money. So just about the time they were old enough to vote, they'd had their third child. And they're going, this isn't going to work. I'm going to be poor all my life. Time to go back to work. Well, the problem was, on welfare, all the medical's taken care of. She's getting the check. Now she goes into the workforce, but she has to find a babysitter for her 3 very young children, unless she has a relative who's going to take them in. She can't afford child care at an entry-level job without a high school diploma. You know, the whole welfare system enticed her to leave high school without that diploma, have 3 children before she entered the workforce. And so she's really in a really bad situation. Most of them go back on welfare, and they're caught forever. And so are their children, because that's the example they see. So, I used to think, before I did this, I'm a libertarian, I don't support taxes. I don't believe in tax-supported welfare, but at least the welfare is doing some good. It's helping people who need it. Boy, was I naive. No, it's destroying the family. And that's just one way in which it does it, but it's really, and with the poor black community, it was horrible, because if in Michigan, the father of your children lived with you, then you didn't get the welfare. So what happened is the men were basically kicked out. You could live with somebody who wasn't the father of your child. So the men were kicked out, and of course, studies show that if men aren't part of a family where they have their children, they generally delay getting into the workforce, because they don't have to support anybody. If they have to support somebody, they get down to business, right? So the men in this situation were not very productive. The women, of course, weren't working, and if they tried to get out of the poverty trap, they rarely got out unless they had a relative who was going to take the kids, so they were really screwed over. It's really destructive, and when you get into, that's why I'm encouraging you to go out and help in your communities, because if you do, you'll learn this stuff firsthand. Telling stories is a powerful way. I told a story like this when I was running against a Democrat for state rep, and he got up and said, well, because I said something like, 95% of my tenants are able-bodied. There's very few that are blind or deaf. I do have a few of them, but 95% are able-bodied and could work. He gets up and says, that's not true. And of course, I got up and said, hey, I'm in there and doing it. Where's your statistics? What evidence do you have? And that's very powerful. So it's something to think about. Okay, well, thank you, Mayor.